episode of Green Justice. It is my pleasure to welcome Robert Jago here. Robert is a citizen of the Kwantlen First Nation, is a journalist, is an entrepreneur, is currently in residence at KPU as a journalist and writer. He's written a ton of materials, including for CBC, The Walrus, National Post, Toronto Star, The Nation, and more. We're going to start by talking about an article he wrote for The Guardian, Warrior Society Rises, How a Mercury Spill in Canada Inspired a Movement. So do you want to just walk us through that? What mercury spill are we talking about here?
Well, first off, I should say that you never get to choose your headlines. So I didn't choose that headline. And I've never liked any headline ever. So with the Guardian piece, that article was uh, intended to be exclusively about environmental racism. And if I'm sure your listeners know, everybody knows environmental racism is the disproportionate effects of pollution on minority communities. So if you're building your hog rendering plant, are you going to build it next to the White Country Club, or are you going to build it next to the new immigrant, development? So traditionally they've gone for the latter, and because of structural issues, a lot of these things happen at or near First Nations because of a whole bunch of things about land use planning that are embedded in the Indian Act and are very interesting for some of us. For most people, not so much. So Grassy Knolls is the prime example of this. It is a Ojibwe community that was located in Northern Ontario. The federal authorities decided to move that community in the early 60s and move it a little bit closer to the city of Kenora. So they uprooted everybody at the behest of forest companies that wanted to get at the land they were on and moved them to this place a little bit further away near Kenora. Unfortunately, that was downstream from a pulp mill where they used mercury as part of their industrial processes. And it didn't take long before that mercury spilled into their waterways. And that spill, I just went on for quite a long time. It spilled, I think, 9 million times the acceptable dose. So it was enough to pollute their waterways, destroy the local industry they'd set up as guides and trappers for tourists, and made their community toxic.
Yeah, so we're talking about 9,000 kilos of mercury, and the acceptable limit is 1 gram.
Mhm.
And 1 gram of mercury is enough to contaminate the waterways, and they dumped nine it's 9,000 kilograms.
Yeah, and when they did it, one thing that I found while researching this was when they did it, they were utterly indifferent. The provincial authorities were utterly indifferent to the problem. They joked about it. I found this one bit hidden in the parliamentary record in Ontario that showed them laughing in Parliament about the spill and patting one member of Parliament on the back for lying to the press and saying it would be fixed in a couple of years. I mean, it wasn't fixed in a couple of years. Here we are, like more than 50 years later, and it's not fixed. So the result for people is a thing called Minamata disease. Minamata disease was first named in Japan, and it is a Parkinson's-like decline in a person. It's fatal, and it's caused by mercury poisoning. And many people there, if not the majority, have it in one form or another. And I mean, there are a couple stories I've done on First Nations issues where you go back a couple of years and everyone is dead. Everyone you talk to and interviewed, even the young people, are dead. And this is one of those stories where all but one of the people I met are gone.
And this
So
story is not that old. This story was like published 6 years ago.
yeah. Yeah. And if you look at the pictures there, I mean, even the young woman that took the pictures, she was a journalism student and she was, 16 or 17, and she was really interested in learning about journalism. And I thought, well, it would be great to have her there as a photographer, get her name in the Guardian, and that could be used as a college application or whatever. She's gone too. The central figure that I interviewed in there, Stephen Foster Sr., he's dead as well. He died because of the physical effects of mercury poisoning. She died because of the sociological effects of mercury poisoning. It's destroyed their community. And that's a primary example of the effects of environmental racism. And I know that's something that even my First Nation is dealing with. We don't have firsthand effects of the pollution anymore. I know that there were some I found in the records in the 70s, 60s, 70s. But for us, what we're seeing are, you know, we have a land crisis. We are desperate for housing. Only like fewer than 20% of our population is able to live on reserve. And our First Nation is in Metro Vancouver, and where housing is insanely expensive. And we have this one reserve in Maple Ridge, which should be prime land, which should be maybe billions of dollars of real estate there. Unfortunately, the federal government controlled land use planning, and so they leased it out to an industrial concern who polluted it so much that we can't use it.
Mm.
And we didn't actually even profit from that. We barely benefited at all from them leasing it to these people. All we have is downside, which is, again, what a lot of these places have. Even when the feds come in and try and help, as which I'm sure they thought they were helping by leasing our land out to someone, it is all just downside for us. And that's with Grassy Narrows. They thought they were helping by moving them closer to Kenora and moving them to this area where they could, attract tourists and trappers and hunters and stuff. I mean, it's lots of animals up there who are all dying as well. But, it's then the pollution spill came because the other side of the coin is they don't really care what happens to Native people at that time, at least. And, the side effect is this horrible pollution crisis. In Grassy Narrows, the side effect of that pollution crisis was that you had a lot of people displaced because all of their jobs got wiped out in a night. Their main food source, the local fish, the walleye, was basically inedible. Even now, they still try and eat it, but not so much because they know that if they eat too much, it's going to give them an amount of disease. So there's a lot of displacement, and that leads people down the street to Kenora, Ontario. Kenora, Ontario is literally the most racist place I've ever been in person. It's, I mean, it's was more racist than Thunder Bay, far more racist than Winnipeg. It is shocking what you see there. And that's an improvement over what it was in the 60s. And in the 60s, an example that someone there gave me was that they didn't let the native kids eat inside the school. Native kids had to eat outside. And this is Northern Ontario, where outside is minus 40 for half the year. So there's a lot of fighting, a lot of struggle, and all of these people flooding into the city from this environmental disaster to the north of them, which inevitably led to conflict. And the source of this conflict was a place called Anishinaabe Park. And Anishinaabe Park is, and this will lead into another story that I wrote, a prime example of how parks are used to dispossess Native people. So I talked to one woman there who was from a village near Kenora. She was sent away to residential school. When she came back, she tried to go home and her home was gone. And not just her home, but her whole village, her community was gone. There was nothing left of it but a park, Anishinaabe Park. And that became a source of, frustration and anger and a boiling point for First Nations people who, again, are dispossessed of this environmental thing. And they're seeing their land destroyed in two different ways. One by industrial pollution and federal good intentions, and the other from parks. So in the face of that, squeezed between that and stuck in this place where everybody hates them, they picked up guns and they seized the park by force. And it was like the first violent standoff, and they were trying to think of a name to call themselves. To the south of them was the American Indian movement, but they didn't want to use that term because AIM had a bad reputation with a lot of people in Canada.
AIM standing for the American Indian Movement
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
formal organization.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I mean, AIM was a really effective organization. It's stuff like Seize Alcatraz. They boast about beating up judges and burning down courthouses and stuff. So they wanted a new name for here, and the name they came up with was the Warrior Society. Now, if you know much about Indigenous politics, First Nations politics, pardon me, you'll know that Warrior Society is a common term now. It wasn't then. They invented it. They invented this method for all this method for all these dispossessed people to come together and to form a type of resistance. So they designed that structure. They designed the language for it. They designed the method of these standoffs, which we've now seen probably a dozen times or more since then, most famously at Oka. And that was a result of this environmental racism that we saw in Grassy Narrows.
Okay. So does this story of Grassy Narrows end, or is the story of Grassy Narrows it is still with us?
It doesn't end. No. The most recent update is from the last week of the Trudeau administration, where they finally got shovels in the ground to build a treatment center in Grassy Narrows itself, which is something they've been fighting for decades. But is that good news? I mean, it means that they can die closer to home. And, you know, for a lot of First Nations politics, the expectations are incredibly low. A roof over your head, drinking water, and a place to die close to your home are not massive aspirational goals. It is below the bare minimum. So they've gone since then from a deep hole to just below the bare minimum.
I wanna kinda go back as well to the Indian Act and its role in all of this.
How in the Indian Act relates to Grassy Narrows is there are 34 provisions of the Indian Act which relate to land management. And those are the ones that I think resulted in a lot of what they faced, how their land was then provided, leased off or sold off or given off to industry, which is something that you see a lot of. The, Here in 2025, that's a little bit harder to do because First Nations have the option to opt out of those 34 sections of the Indian Act by adopting land code, the First Nations Land Management Act. But that's a complex process. It requires a referendum, and then it requires an expensive administration process. And once you do that, then you are more in the driver's seat when it comes to leasing out your land for those purposes, which is why you now see a lot of First Nations partnerships with industry and real estate, where you're leasing out reserve land for things like that. But whereas in the past, you might see leases where the First Nation gets $100 a year. Here, it's more like $50 million a year, $100 million a year, whatever it is in rents and leases.
Let me return to this question of the parks that comes up in the story of Grassy Narrows. So is that where we get at this thing that you call green colonialism in the article that you wrote for The Walrus? Cash Canada's national parks are a colonial crime scene. And I know you didn't give it the title. I like the title, but, in that essay for The Walrus, you have this great line where you say, "Canadians have always thought of their country as an archipelago of cities in a sea of untouched wilderness, and that this is an idealized version of the country that props up what you name as green colonialism in the creation of the parks as this kind of untouched the idea, the mythology behind it being that they are untouched wilderness."
When you think about green colonialism, I guess where that comes from is you think about early in the BC Treaty process, where they decided that parks are going to be exempt from any treaty negotiations. So that parks were one of those things, one of those ways that they could alienate land from us. After which, you have Trudeau's promise to turn like 10% of Canada into parks, which again is just more land that we will never gain access to or never get back or never be able to use the way we want it to. That the concept of like wilderness, first off, is just nonsense here, because if you think about it, you think about primeval forest, but it's not primeval. There's a book by Charles C. Mann called 1491, and that's talks about what the Americas were like pre-contact. I know there's some criticism of the book, and it's not all perfect, but look at what he says about the Amazon and the discoveries you make in the Amazon that shows that the Amazon isn't a wild forest, it's a park. It's an overgrown park. It's an overgrown garden, pardon me.
Yeah.
It's an overgrown orchard. That just the distribution of plants there doesn't match with what you would see in nature. And that's what we think of when we think of wilderness. When we think of wilderness here, it's pretty much the same thing. You go to the beach in Jericho, or actually just walk along this seashore in Vancouver, and you'll notice that in one spot there's all giant clams for some reason. And why are those there? That's what a weird freak of nature. And then you go somewhere else and there's none at all. And then it's all just mussels everywhere. And that's not nature. That's a side effect of cultivation. That's a side effect of indigenous development of that land. Walk through the city and you can walk through parts of Vancouver and you'll be walking on a road that is 1,000 years old. Kingsway, for example. The forests are like that. Just because non-natives aren't using it now doesn't mean that we didn't use it before. In fact, we still use a lot of it now. But by saying that no one had ever lived there, making it terra nullius, it erases us from it, it keeps us away from it, and it constrains our economic opportunities as well. And it puts us in these little boxes where we're easier to control. And that was actually a big impetus for the creation of parks like Algonquin Park in Ontario. It's the crown jewel of the park system there. But that park was created, the way that park was created was by kicking Native people out. They didn't want Native people there. They thought they were going to destroy all the animals. They thought they were going to hunt them to extinction because, of course, you can't trust natives to hunt responsibly in their view. So they got rid of the villages there. I believe they even burned them out of there. We see similar things in Banff, for example. There's a place like Banff, again, is one of Canada's crown jewels, and there is nothing good there's no good story about how that park came about. Whether it was the native dispossession, like destroying villages and expelling people because of their race, or the slave labor of Ukrainians and Italians and Germans during World War I that built the roads there. There's no good thing that ever happened there. It's amazing that people want to go there. I mean, if anywhere is haunted, that place is haunted. It's just cursed on levels upon levels upon levels. So, I mean, another example here in the city, I mean, there was this example before in Grassy Narrows. Of course, there's the example of Vanier Park in Vancouver, which was created by destroying the community of Senok, putting their homes on barges, which was covered in the press. It was so recent. It was condemned in Parliament. It was so cruel. It was seen as so wrong at the time. And the people were then expelled and sent to the North Shore. So all of these aspects are things that, you know, are the main core of green colonialism is it's you dress it up as green. You've heard of greenwashing. Well, green it's colonialism washing with a green veneer. I've been talking the last couple weeks with a lot of different First Nations because I'm working on this environmental project, this nature project. And the way I break down the door with them and that gets 100% positive feedback is I say, okay, look, yes, I'm working with a nature organization, but I promise you, it's not like those other ones. It's a minority controlled. The board is natives and Chinese people because they're afraid when they see these nature organizations, they're afraid of them because of what they're coming in to do. And if you look at the board, if you look at the key staff of any environmental organization in this country, you'll notice that the demographics do not match this country in 2025. That they're heavy sunscreen users.
That's a very polite way of putting it.
Yes. So it's that's the perspective that comes in to these communities and starts pushing us around and telling us to protect X, Y, or Z.
This dynamic that you're pointing to here, where environmental groups will be like, save nature, save nature. In doing so, want to, how would you describe it?
You describe it with the premise that they begin with. The premise they begin with is that nature and people are separate things.
Mhm.
Because
Right.
their ancestors came off a boat recently, so they feel like aliens in this country. We didn't. Like, we've been here since we've been here so long that our DNA has modified to match this land. Our physical bodies have changed to fit ourselves into this country. Our skin color has changed, our hair texture. Like, we've been developing here for long enough that we're not the same people that, you know, floated over, walked over, came over here somehow 20,000, 25,000 years ago. If you think about like a funny way to like an interesting way, I think, to get people to understand how long we've been here is to show them a picture of a recreation of what English people looked like 10,000 years ago.
Mm.
Have you ever seen a picture of what English people looked like 10,000 years ago?
I know.
They were black.
Really?
Yes. There were no white people in England 10,000 years ago. The English people were black people with, albeit blue eyes, but black people, wavy hair. They had dark skin. That's what Englishmen looked like 10,000 years ago. And they've been there so long that their bodies change, they adapt to their environment. They're part of the nature of that place, as we're
Right.
part of the nature of that place. We're not aliens to it. We didn't come off a boat. We fit in. We don't have to do a whole bunch, we're not seeing ourselves completely separate. We can
Yeah.
see ourselves fitting in. Like these animals have evolved with us for 10,000 years, 20,000 years. So we don't see as much of that dichotomy as they do, who really have made no effort to develop a meaningful connection here to overcome for that to overcome that gap.
Can you talk a bit more about the project you just mentioned that you're working on?
Sure. So I'm working with an organization called the Nature Agency, and their goal for this project is to actually bridge that gap that I talked about a second ago, to get non-natives to see themselves more as part of nature and to understand how to do that. So, in order to get that across, I'm speaking to a lot of different First Nations communities, and we're going to be producing content later this summer from at least 15, 20 different communities where we're going to be talking to people, we're going to be following them in their daily work, and we're going to be showing how that connection to nature works in real life. Our audience aren't hippies, they're tatted up, truck driving, hockey watching, sports TV loving people. That's who I want to reach to because these are the people who don't normally see themselves as part of nature, who are they're not normally targeted by environmental groups. And I want to target them because I think they're probably the most open-minded on this kind of thing. They're not coming in thinking they're right. They tend to be a little more open. And so I'm not going to be telling the story by doing that same thing that you see in a lot of native content where you bring in like 40 elders and they all talk about something or other. I personally, I my mind shuts down when that content comes on. So what I want to do is bring in people that are like them because like these hockey truck driving people, I want them to see a young native person with sleeve tats and a gun and a truck and see that someone like them can be part of nature and see themselves as part of nature and not it doesn't make them a hippie. It just makes them like really a part of this place. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. Because if you see yourself a part of this place, you're less likely to want to destroy any part of it.
Walk me through this. Like, what's the connection between, like, the kinda cognitive realization that you're part of nature and what happens in society?
I'm thinking of the person in their truck in the suburbs
Okay.
who states opinions on social media, votes a certain way, pushes for policies that the political parties cater to. That sort of median person, that's who we want to reach. We want to reach people who roll up the rim to win, basically.
You know, this coffee that I'm drinking right here came free because I rolled up the rim and I won. That's a tangent, by the way.
Mm.
So does climate change play into this? Like, do you is that part of, where you want to raise people's awareness around.
Of course, that's part of everything that you do with any sort of nature work. I think the discussion in a lot of places in Canada has shifted from climate change denial to pushing for climate change adaptation. And honestly, when you look at the work the First Nations are doing, it tends to be that on the ground. It's all about adaptation. And this is not the first change in climate our cultures have seen. So we're a little bit more adept at that and more comfortable with it than non native people are. But we do wanna see stuff that is just utterly ruinous, like pipelines digging up riverbeds or massive potential oil spills or, these when you look at First Nations, there's not necessarily an opposition to development. People and governments tend to be open. When you put it to a vote in a democratic nation, it often passes. It gets support. but they want to see accommodation in order to protect nature and to protect our natural resources that we don't see in a lot of developments. So I think about like the TMX, for example. My First Nations request was that when you're building it, don't build it during this season because it'll disrupt the fisheries, and don't do maintenance during this season when it disrupts the fisheries. They said no to that. They wouldn't accommodate that. But if there was an audience out there, if there were more people who could push that, then we would see more accommodations like that.
I think that must come from a different way of thinking because, like, earlier in the conversation where we're talking about exploitation of nature and conservation in parks, it seems that Western settler society operates with this binary, right? Like, you're either going to cut down every single tree in your clear cutting for to maximize profit, or you're gonna say it's enclosed in the boundaries of a park where no one is allowed to do absolutely anything. But rather than that kind of dichotomous framing, what you're suggesting is something that's much more, subtle in a sense, in terms of accommodating development in ways that respect nature. In your example, the fish that would be impacted by
Mhm.
pipeline development.
Yeah, it's putting those perspectives first. Non-indigenous. Coming back to environmental racism, you're not going to build the rendering plant next to the posh houses. You're going to build it next to the immigrant houses. Well, that seems to be how environmental concerns are accommodated when it comes to things like pipelines. That the indigenous needs are not accommodated, the non-indigenous needs are. I mean, there are examples in the East where they're doing some sort of development, and that's just basically the core of environmental racism. That's just how it happens. That's the core of environmental racism. That's just how it happens. It's because when they do accommodation and remediation, it happens to help non-natives and to do nothing for us. So this is and when it does help non-natives, it helps them in that sense that it preserves this illusion they have of pristine wilderness
Yeah,
versus this living environment that you're part of and that you use, which is sort of
correct.
our perspective and probably the correct perspective.
Can I ask you about one more article?
Mhm,
The Hungry People that
mhm.
you wrote for The Walrus. The article opens with a scene setter where you're working in a Stolo fishing boat. As the boats come in, I'm just quoting from the article here. As our boats come in, with your fishing, with your catch, trucks swarm us. Non-natives looking to buy fish. Our tote might hold $2,000 worth of salmon, but it's all accounted for. And the government's put off signing the contract that would allow us to sell any extra anyway. That night, as we're washing down the boat, we overhear the news on TV.
So we had been out fishing. I was writing a thing and I wanted to join one of the family fishing boats. So I went out with my brother in his boat and we had a food fishery scheduled, but you know how it is. So that was of course being repurposed for sales because the feds aren't signing off on the sales, even though they're supposed to, and it's our damn fish anyway. So we went out on that fishery. We did very well. We filled an entire tote with them, came back to shore, and the second that they saw our boats coming in, all these non-natives just started pouring onto the docks to start buying fish. And so we did a brisk market. Everybody did a brisk sales. And when we finally cleaned everything up, got home, the local news came on. And on the local news, we saw that DFO was on there warning people not to do what the people in the trucks just did, not to trust us with fish. They were warning people about health dangers of purchasing fish from us. So that was l- insulting, incredibly, incredibly insulting to say that we don't know how to handle fish. So that our family has been out on the river in living memory at least 200 years, but much further, much longer than that, and have not yet died en masse from food poisoning. We know how to handle fish. We have not just cultural knowledge of it, but we have experience with it. We have techniques with it that have been practiced for a very long time to know how to manage food safely and to know when not to take certain fish and to know, when it's not safe. That knowledge is not some mythical oral story. These are like apprenticeships of fishermen going back generations and generations. And to have some pissant bureaucrat go on TV and insult us and say that we're idiots that don't know this, how to manage the resource that's the most central item to our culture is, yeah, it was insulting. And it was one of the two reasons that I ended up doing that article.
What was the second?
They're the home island so the Kwantlen First Nation is spread over a bunch of reserves, but the population center is McMillan Island near Fort Langley. And next to it is Bray Island. They're about a meter apart. And there is a park on Bray Island that's run by Metro Vancouver Regional District. And that park has a beach. And on summer days, when it is very hot in the valley, some kids from reserve walked over and tried to use the beach because that is a public beach owned by Metro Vancouver that was full of people from Fort Langley. So when they went to use the beach, the people in charge there, the park wardens, told the native kids to get out and go back to their side of the island. So when you see that like this is obviously our territory, and it was created as a park that was in order to alienate it from us, being told that we can't use a park on our own territory a meter from the border of reserve is pretty, again, very, very insulting. It's the same feeling they had about the fish, and it's the same feeling that those people had in Algonquin Park, and it's the same feeling they had wherever, that Indians will wreck it. Indians will come in and ruin it because they don't know how to take care of nature or to be here. We're going to hunt the fish to extinction. We're going to pollute this. We're going to wreck the beach just by being there. It's that same perspective that wherever we are, we're ruining things.
Which, like, I'm not a psychologist, but it seems like there's a lot of projection there for, for it's not First Nations or Indigenous peoples who are hunting things to extinction. It's the European settlers.
Well, not since the ground sloth.
Yeah, that's true. The other thing that's going on in this article, though, is that there's this massive and sad irony that European modernity wouldn't be what it is were it not for the appropriation of indigenous agricultural practices and techniques. And I think that's a really important point for us to address as well. That it was indigenous peoples who developed corn, for example, and potatoes, both of which have fueled European expansion, as well as the case of the guano as fertilizer, which indigenous peoples in Peru were using to fertilize the what would have otherwise been fertile, not very fertile grounds. Was that a motivation for you?
Sure. So there's a thing called the Columbian Exchange, which is after Columbus, a lot of materials went from the old world to this world, to the Western Hemisphere, and vice versa. And there is an impression in Canada that the Columbian Exchange was mostly one way. You hear it in comment boards where you'll see non-natives saying, "Before us, you didn't have the wheel." I mean, first off, we did, but before us, you didn't have the wheel or iPhones, as
Right.
if they brought iPhones on the Mayflower. And they don't appreciate that, number one, every single piece of technology and material culture that we have here, we paid for. So, number one, we're not going to say thank you for stuff we paid for, just like I'm not going to say thank you to Amazon. That's what the money is for. And we paid for that with our resources, which we sold on a free market. Those resources were significant. And that's the other half of the Columbian Exchange that's forgotten. So, and the reason I think it's forgotten is because of a basic fundamental ignorance among most people, it seems, about how agricultural products come about. They think that an orange just falls from a tree like that, and it doesn't. That's not how, what an orange looked like to begin with. They think that a strawberry was always like that. They think that an avocado was always a whole bunch of avocado in it. And the corn wasn't just a weed, teosinte. So that of course is not true. You see, if you go to Peachland here in BC, you will see people making new kinds of peaches, doing their best to cultivate new forms of peaches. That's kind of what they specialize in. I had an orange the other day from TNT that was just created. You know, if you ever seen a clementine, that was made in the 1800s, late 1800s, by a guy named Clementine. So to create these new foods requires a lot of human ingenuity over a long period of time. And what we saw with with the climate exchange is the product of hundreds or thousands of years of indigenous work and thought and technology produced this huge basket of fruits and vegetables. And those were sent abroad as part of the Columbian Exchange. Think of Italian food without tomatoes. Think of Indian food without chili peppers. Think of, the world without corn or potatoes. And it's a really, really impoverished world. Think of millennials without guacamole, without avocado toast. They would wither up and die, or
And
they'd probably save all that money and buy houses. But you have all of these things going over, but the most important of which was nitrogen-based fertilizers. Before that, Europeans were using manure, animal manure where they could, but often what's called night soil, i.e., they made it themselves. And it wasn't very efficient. And it led to frequent famines. Those famines, in some cases even led to cannibalism. In England, up until the 1500s, 1600s, the English periodically ate each other in these famines. After they discovered nitrogen fertilizer, then that went to Europe. They understood what it was. They understood you can get it from guano because the Inca had been doing that. I mean, the Inca are the most fascinating culture in the history of the earth, I suspect, because it is the only culture, the only society, the only empire in the history of the world that was notable for two really big things. Number one, it had no markets because it had a totally socialized economy. And number two, it had no hunger. It is the only civilization ever to never have a famine. And it had that because of their abundant fertilizer and their way of organizing society, of course. With you paid your taxes in form of agricultural labor. But it's once they took that to Europe, it allowed that population boom. It allowed them to spread over here. It allowed them to spread over the world. It allowed them to grow and develop and become much more stable. And I mean, this, anyways. So that's I think the most important part of it. If you want to see the value of the Columbian Exchange, go to YouTube, and you can find many channels where you can see people who specialize in cooking ancient dishes. And look at what Europeans ate before the Columbian Exchange. Look at lasagna before the Columbian Exchange. Just imagine if you were forced to eat barley and fish oil a lot, every meal, all day.
yeah, okay, I will put that on my list of things to do for sure. Because tomatoes, everything that all the tomatoes, avocados, there's overwhelming abundance of fruits and vegetables.
Pineapples, think of pineapple, think of Hawaiian pizza without tomatoes and pineapple.
Impossible. Uh,
Yeah,
the
it's cheese toast.
I wanna say the what you're the the importance of the guano industry, it's just one of those serendipitous things where prior to this, independent of this interview, I've been reading about the history of guano, and it like, it absolutely, like, it fueled the ability of the population growth and the productivity of European agriculture to the point where colonialism and imperialism was possible. It literally refashioned the shape of relations on the earth. Uh,
The best example of that is this country, the Republic of Nauru, which was it's an island country in the South Pacific, population of about 9,000. And it was a British colony, I think maybe later an Australian colony. And it was a gigantic deposit of guano. Their whole country was a gigantic deposit of guano with a thin belt of beach around it and a few trees. And the Europeans mined every last bit of it until there was nothing left but a pit, a barren pit surrounded by, a few trees, a few palm trees, and these 9,000 people. It They had a little bit of money left that they had saved from the exploitation, but they made the very fateful mistake of investing it in a play to finance a Broadway or a West End play, which then failed. And then they ended up broke with this giant pit that formed the entire center of their country from the colonial extraction of guano. Now, in the new version of colonialism, Australia leases that pit to place migrants who describe it as the worst place they can possibly imagine.
Hmm. Shall we do what we were discussing earlier before starting to record, what the media often does, which is end on a happy note? I'm just
Uh,
where 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 do we go from here? Like, where do you see chances for improvement?
Chances for improvement in
Anything.
not in the near future, probably not for the next little while, just because of Trump and the reaction to Trump. And so this is not the first time the Americans have tried to take us over in BC. Now in the East, yeah, they tried a couple times as well, but here they tried too. So up until 1858, this colony, well, up until like the 1830s, 1840s, I guess, this was jointly run by the Americans, Canadians, or Americans and British, pardon me. And then, of course, they signed the Oregon Treaty, and then it became separate, and it was administered by the Hudson's Bay Company. Under the Hudson's Bay Company, this place was run pretty well, actually. All they wanted to do was buy stuff from us and sell stuff to us, and that's it. And we got along fine. They fit themselves into the community here. They became just like the Hudson's Bay tribe. We intermarried. It was fine. Got along great. Then they discovered gold. The Americans started coming up from California, from the California genocide, which nobody knows about, but is a real thing. And they came up here en masse, and it started to threaten British interests. And the Imperial Parliament felt that the Hudson's Bay Company couldn't manage it. So they stepped in, took over, asserted control because of this American threat. They took extraordinary measures because of the Americans and founded a colony here, which was New Caledonia, became British Columbia, united the colonies into Greater British Columbia, all in response to this fear of Americans. And as part of this fear of the Americans, they brought in a new governor eventually, Governor, I think, Moody, who instantly began dispossessing natives of land in order to flood the territory with settlers in order to preempt American interests here. And they started building up, Fort Victoria, for example, became very populous at that time. 4 years after that, we had the Great Smallpox epidemic caused by colonial authorities. When there was a small case of smallpox in Victoria, they sent all the natives there home to their communities, and they all took it with them. Population collapsed by 60 to 90%. So we had an American threat. It required extraordinary measures. It required more extraordinary measures. And within 4 years, we went from the situation where we kind of got along. We had a reasonable partner fitting in. We had rapid development. It was a nice, fair mutual exchange. And then we have colonial dispossession, oppression, subjugation, and villages, some of which were wiped out entirely, others collapsed by 90%, 60%, and we've not yet recovered from that. And that's what happens when we're threatened. Well, we're threatened now. So it's hard to think of what positive things will happen from being threatened now if that's what happened last time. For myself, one suggestion that I've talked with other Native people about as a way of overcoming this is that we have unceded land, which means nobody has title to it but us. We could form a treaty with Canada, or we could form a treaty with somebody else. So if Canada is going to threaten us and threaten our livelihoods the way that they have in the past, and the way that what happened to us in the 1850s and 60s, we could go to somebody else and see if we can get a better deal. And that might not work out well for you guys, but it's not about that. It's more about what we want. So, in terms of positive things, I don't see anything positive coming from Canada, but I do see at least that we have options.
That's, yeah, that's a really interesting and for me, like, novel, and new way of thinking about this dynamic that we're in right now. So, thank you. This whole podcast has been a continual revelation to me of, new stuff that, yeah, I will be thinking about for quite a while. So, thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you. Nice to talk to you.